Dan, great for having you once again at the Roma Summit. Last year, of course, you were a keynote speaker in Pristina. This year, we're under very different circumstances, of course, due to COVID. And I actually wanted to start with this. I think this issue has been coming up more and more, and it's been highlighted, particularly by the Council of Europe's Human Rights Commissioner, Dunja Mijatović, and that's that marginalized and discriminated communities are being disproportionately affected by the pandemic. How does this play out when it comes to Romani communities?
Firstly, thank you for your kind invitation again. Good to see you again, Philip. Yes, the circumstances are what they are, and we are doing our best to go ahead with our work. Indeed, as Council of Europe Commissioner, as well as OSCE and UN and other organizations have underlined, the crisis has affected and continues to affect disproportionately the more vulnerable communities and groups. And it's because of their circumstances in which they live often, and in the case of Roma and Sinti, and in particular the communities themselves are very often placed marginally in localities. It's not unusual that they are not only marginally, but sometimes quite segregated from, kilometers away from the closest locality, lacking a basic infrastructure, access to running water, potable water, lack of access to electricity for many of them, no sewage infrastructure. So in these circumstances, when everybody knows that it's essential to maintain the basic hygiene, washing hands, using disinfectant, if you have disinfectant in the case of Roma and Sinti, is posing a serious challenge for them, and therefore they are more prone to be contaminated with the virus. That on top is exacerbated also by a unfriendly and often biased rhetoric in the mass media and by the mass media, where the mass media is just acting as a drive and a channel for statements of politicians and representatives of authorities, or themselves engaging in producing articles and texts that are biased. These both situations impact negatively and exacerbate already a very difficult situation for Roma and Sinti communities. Yes.
And I guess away from hygiene, and I guess away from the media space as well, have you seen cases where states and institutions have been particularly unfriendly and harsh towards the communities? And there's been cases in Bulgaria, for example, communities were sprayed with disinfectant from crop dusters. In Slovakia, the only villages which were being tested, where testing was done by the army, was Roma communities. Across Central and Eastern Europe, there seems to be this pattern of aggressive and quite extreme police, excessive force to maintain the lockdown when it comes to Roma communities. How have states been performing?
The attitude and treatment by states and local authorities towards their Roma population, Roma and Sinti population, depending on the region and on the location, was generally not a friendly and not a proper one, according to the responsibilities and obligations they have by laws and by international human rights standards. There were situations of extreme measures and interventions, like full lockdown of Roma communities or districts or areas inhabited by Roma, under the guise of security and prevention, although full communities were under lockdown and very strict restrictions, even when only a handful of individuals were identified positive with COVID-19. Or such a measure was not applied equally in the case of non-Roma. Then authorities took it to the public and portrayed and presented or introduced Roma into the public as being undisciplined, careless, disregarding the very important measures of social and physical distancing. That, therefore, being a risk to the general public and to the general population. Obviously, this is not true, and such politicians or officials that made such statements never presented, compelling science-based and fact-based evidence to support their claims. But there was enough to create an environment where Roma were scapegoated, Roma were accused as being the ones that are spreading the virus. Well, that's terrible, especially that many of the communities of Roma and Sinti were actually themselves more vulnerable because of the circumstances that I've presented just before that. Yeah.
Backtrack a little bit, and I guess this is more for viewers who are less familiar with the work of the Roma Summit over the past 6-7 years, and generally the position of Roma in the Western Balkans. How would you assess this position where it is today, and what are some of the trends when it comes to, as you mentioned, some of the issues, but of course inclusiveness and participation? How would you assess the position in the Western Balkans?
Well, without daring to venture into, claiming that I have substantive knowledge about the situation in the Western Balkans, not to mention that the situation can vary from country to country. The majority of the countries there, they are on their path to EU accession, or they aspire to accede to European Union. And that's a good process. It's a good momentum. It takes long. It was the same for Romania, for Bulgaria, and countries before that. It takes long, and states really must demonstrate that progressively they are incorporating and they are embedding into their policies values and principles that are promoted and practiced within the European Union. And that starts, and that is actually an eligibility requirement for acceding countries, that they demonstrate to establish institutions and laws and policies with regard to respect and protection of rights of national or ethnic minorities. And as such, countries have established national councils for combating discrimination, equality bodies. They have established, or they consolidated existing ombudsperson institution. And these are very good developments. Of course, having proper frameworks, it's an important step. But in itself, an existence of a National Council for Combating Discrimination does not produce effect. That body needs to transpose the mandate and the political and institutional leverage they have into real life by being very proactive and conducting assessments, monitoring, resolving the cases that are registered for their attention and for their resolution. So they have to practice this. Only if they are using to a very good extent their mandate, then you can see progress. Otherwise, we end up in a situation, and that's a very unfortunate situation, we see Europe-wide. And here I'm referring not only to countries on their path to EU accession, but also countries in the European Union already. You have plenty of good frameworks and Roma inclusion strategies, some for more than 15 years. Yet you don't see progress, or the progress is very, very modest. And because much of it is lying within this realm of declaring things and not implementing things. A number of good initiatives are unfortunately only project-based, short-lived, therefore, for 1 year, for 2 years, and then immediately after the expiry of the contract and on the budget, there is no continuation, there is no sustainability. And without making a good use of those piloted initiatives and policies at local level, and without a good use of the developed good practices, and then scaling up and adopting them as national policies that are then financed by the state budget, you cannot have this systemic change.
Would you understand this disconnect to be from policy to implementation? Why are we in this case?
We have to face a terrible reality. Roma population throughout Europe, unfortunately, is in most of the countries they live, is unwelcome. And that's very weird, absurd, because Roma were living on the European continent since 1,000 years already. Yeah. So they are Europeans as everyone else, but they are not felt as such, they are not perceived as such, and populations and societies often they let this know by attitude and statements. It's not unusual to hear people, sometimes extremists and radicals, but also sometimes regular people in society telling the Roma to go back to India, or something like that. Well, as long as there is this attitude, and that attitude is found and witnessed not only among the regular population, regular people, but also within the body of institutions like state officials. It means these strategies are a sort of a window dressing situation where it's more declarative, and it stays there, because as long as you don't see a political commitment matched by deeds, by facts, where you have a statement, you have a strategy that covers many areas that are all important with regard to inclusion of Roma and combating racism and discrimination, and you don't allocate budget for that, you cannot hope that those provisions will implement themselves out of thin air. You need to allocate the proper financial resources, the proper personnel and human resources for those provisions to produce realities that are visible, that are quantifiable in people's lives. And that's unfortunately not happening.
Speaking about some concrete strategies, I think recently expired the EU strategic framework for Roma, and October this month, a new 10-year strategy was announced, I see, by the Commissioner for Equality. The targets we have laid out, we expect to make real progress by 2030. What is different? How does it differ to the previous one, and how right are they to have such expectations?
Let me put it a little bit differently. If we are to speak of the European institutions and international institutions and their attitude towards Roma inclusion and towards eradicating racism and discrimination, the situation is much better. It is because of this international pressure and continued work that countries and national governments have established such strategies. Of course, they were not established totally out of good faith and goodwill, because they were part of this deal. If you want to join the club, the European Union, you have to fulfill a number of criteria. Yeah? And these are steps that were required, and countries they established that, and that's good. But then the problem is that they were fully dependent or overwhelmingly dependent on EU funding. Well, that's the problem with the Roma inclusion nowadays, after 15 years of international policies and strategies and so on. These are citizens of the countries in which they live. So their problems are the responsibility of national governments. International organizations have a mandate and responsibility to support, to assist, to complement the efforts of the national governments, not to substitute their duty and obligation.
Of course, yeah.
Yes, and that's the problem. This step has not yet been made.
So the disconnect essentially comes down to the level of national governments.
Obviously, it was always the case. Sometimes, governments are playing with these statements, saying that this is a European problem. It's like pushing the problem.
Like with migrant crisis.
Yes.
Speaking of this incentive, how and we mentioned the Western Balkans, how effective as an incentive is it with the countries going through a recession now? Do you see that there is willingness? Do you see any sincere sort of steps being taken in order to whether it's integration or to fight discrimination of Roma communities, to really implement them?
Yes, there are.
There would be some good examples.
And there are good examples, and I think it's unfortunate, but it stays only at this area of promoting access to education, and in particular access to early education and to primary education, where in the past decade some progress was registered, and that's praiseworthy. Governments have, let's say, intensified their efforts and attention to ensure that more and more Roma children and pupils and students have access to equal education, to quality education, and non-segregated education. Yet the last assessment from EU Fundamental Rights Agency actually introduced new data that was gathered by them through these EU MIDIS surveys, large-scale surveys, and segregation actually has increased from a approximate 10%, as it was identified a decade ago, to 15%. So some situations is not only that they are stagnating and there is no progress, but in some areas the situation is actually worsening. Yes. So, but nevertheless, there is good progress with regard to accessing early education and primary education. There is also an increase in participation and continued education of young Roma at the level of high school, and also some progress at the level of tertiary education. Many governments have introduced this measure of specially allocated places for Roma students, where they enter these places if they fulfill a minimum threshold of academic performance, and that's only for the entry. It's like a boost. It's like a positive discrimination, if you want. And then everyone is treated like a regular student, and so on. And that's a good measure, and it helped increase the number of young Roma continuing education at these levels. There is a good progress in terms of tertiary education, yet, unfortunately, that is only partially because of the governments with the introduction of these special places. Because especially at the tertiary education level, you need more resources to be able to sustain yourself throughout 3 to 5 or 7 years of education, and very often in larger cities where the living expenses are, bigger and so on. Therefore, such effort was compensated to good extent by international foundations. One of them being the Roma Education Fund, and it happened that for 6 years I was managing the higher education scholarship program for 16 countries in Europe, including Balkans, obviously. And I know firsthand their needs, but I've seen also their success. So for a decade it was proven that with a minimum support, it was roughly 800 euro per academic year per student. It helps students to continue and stay in education for years, finish their BA, then enter MA, and a good number of them actually starting and concluding with PhD studies. So this is one domain which is very good. Some other areas where there was progress is with civil registration. Many of these pre-accession funding instruments of the EU have focused on addressing this issue, and by the range of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of Roma people were properly registered. Birth certificates, IDs, and so on. And with that, you had an increased rate of registration to health services, obviously to education, and sometimes it also helped with the residential status of people.
There's been cases, of course, across the region where such issues have been manipulated, used for political purposes, getting Roma to mass vote for particular candidates as well. Has there been a case of governments then using, whether it's towards international bodies, whether it's for internal purposes, using Roma communities for their purposes, but then actually showing very little willingness to support or actually integrate substantially?
Political manipulation and vote manipulation is a phenomenon that happens often and in many countries. In different variations. In different regions, in more advanced democracies, in developing democracies, if you want. And this is actually assessed and observed by the OSCE ODIHR, by my organization, the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, where our elections department is seen as a sort of a world, or at least the European standard in terms of election observation. And their reports are introducing findings in this regard, where you have political parties that are engaging in such illegal practices of manipulating. And the Roma communities, are always targeted.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, if you ask Roma, they all know it. They know that now there are elections coming, so they will be visited, they will be invited, they will be tempted. Some parties are giving them staple food,
Mm-hmm.
oil, sugar, flour, whatever. In a number of countries, it's been observed that they are paying people, and there is a price per vote. I mean, it was not a secret. Yeah, in the Balkans, it was like the equivalent of €5 per vote.
Yeah.
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 So such practices they occur,
Mm.
but they are illegal, and our reports are, introducing this information to the public as a way to show that this has to be addressed. And the good part is that a number of countries have introduced legal provisions that they see and they state this problem as a serious one.
Mm-hmm.
So whoever is found engaging in such practices, they can suffer some more serious consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And that will act as a deterrent.
Mm-hmm.
It's always like that,
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, people don't act by default out of their good conscience.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we have rules, to sort of regulate our behavior within the boundaries of
Mm-hmm.
what is considered acceptable and what is considered not acceptable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in this regard, I would point here to a situation that is relevant to Roma. They are often victims of racism and discrimination. Yeah. And the real problem here is that when crimes, especially if there is evidence that those crimes are committed, stemming from a biased motivation, a hate motivation, a racial motivation, that crime becomes even more
Mm-hmm.
severe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the worst, the ugliest of the
Sure.
crimes. Yeah. This is the kind of thinking and ideology that has led to the Holocaust,
Mm-hmm.
genocides,
Sure.
and so on. Yeah, it's the ugliest.
Sure.
So when you have clear evidence that crimes against Roma and Sinti are often biased and racially and hate motivated,
Mm-hmm.
and justice systems are failing to punish the perpetrators to the full extent of the
Mm-hmm.
law and
As a hate crime.
as a hate crime, then we speak of racism. That's obviously an act of racism,
Mm-hmm.
structural, institutional, systemic,
Mm-hmm.
as you want.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the ultimate demonstration of racism. And as long as this racism is not addressed properly, all these inclusion strategies and policies will fail.
Mm-hmm.
Because the problem faced by Roma and many of the Sinti communities, although many of them they live in Western Europe, in
Mm-hmm.
countries where overall the situation is better, and sometimes that comes with some improvements for them too. Yes, but the racism is always there,
Mm-hmm.
and if you don't address this head on and clearly and call it for what it is, racism, then this issue of poverty will never be resolved, because the poverty is a symptom of racism, and it's not a racism from yesterday, but it's from centuries.
Sure.
Yeah.
What is the role of the media in this? There is this idea that, of course, that the past decade or so, we're seeing democratic backsliding, we're seeing illiberal democracies, we're seeing, in general, this sort of populist wave across much of the world, but especially Central and Eastern Europe. And this has been sort of followed through by a very controversial role of the media, which is now then broken into social media and all these phenomena that we see. How does the issue of Roma fit into this? I mean, with the migrant crisis, you see a clear pattern, you see clear sort of targeting, sophisticated campaigns. How do Roma fit into this?
There is hype, and media is portraying that. So temporarily, the old situation about presenting Roma as at the cause of evils in the society is subsiding a little bit. Yeah, but then when the crisis is not at a peak, then
comes back in.
Yeah, it comes back. Roma were never disappearing from the spectrum of media, because it's we have to face it. Media often, and especially nowadays, is a sensationalist media. It looks for something that they perceive is bringing their higher rating. And unfortunately, it's not only their perception, but it's proven that people consume this kind of news and media.
So it's responding actually to what consumer...
Yes. So they are creating, but sometimes they are also feeding a demand that it's out there.
Sure.
And Roma were always there. And it's a very disproportionate, it's a biased portrayal of Roma. Actually, I would dare to say that one of the biggest disservice that it's made to Roma, besides, let's say, ignorance and lack of interest in their problems and to support their inclusion, is a disservice done by the mass media. So on an already grave situation, with so many of the Roma people living in poverty and often in situations of extreme poverty, including within the European Union, yes, you have the media who comes and puts fire on top of it. It's rarely where you see media engaging in producing some, let's say, objective or neutral or sometimes positive texts and products in the media.
And we're talking relatively across, from the Western Balkans to Central Europe to Western...
Yes, unfortunately there is not a big difference whether we speak of Balkans or countries outside or within European Union. And that's the problem that I hinted to. It doesn't matter how developed a state is from a democratic standpoint. When it's about Roma, you always have a good segment of that population that is resenting Roma, that is rejecting Roma. Yes. And that's not because some of them are not necessarily poor. Yeah. So and they are rejecting them because of the perceived race and that they don't like them. And that's the problem. And if you don't tackle this problem, which is the root cause of this divide and the gap between the Roma and the mainstream population, you cannot hope to address this inclusion problem.
I was interested in the work of your office, and of course you've been involved in this inclusion process throughout your term, and as you just told me now, your mandate finishes in February of this year. What would you say have been the biggest accomplishments or achievements that you've managed to make in such a complex environment and field?
Well, I rejoined OSCE, and this time to lead the contact point for Roma and Sinti issues of the OSCE ODIHR in the beginning of 2018. And as such, I started a last part of what is maximum possible within the OSCE, which is a non-career organization and only allows for a maximum of 10 years of service. I obviously took over on the work done by my predecessor, By the way, her name is Miriam Karoi, former colleagues in the office before, and then after, after I left in 2011, she became, after a while, the chief of the contact point. So a good part of the work was continued by her, and I continued, and where possible, I added new activities and more value. But 3 years, it's a good time, but it's not a long time.
Not enough.
And now, this year, you can see, I mean, we are really affected by the circumstances with the COVID. So our operations have suffered as well. But I would say that I introduced or reintroduced a more focus on building relations with the local Roma organizations. And we've started to cooperate, and the cooperation is not always contract-based, so they are not receiving funding for that. But we agree each other that this is something useful, important for Roma, and they also volunteer information and sometimes look for advice, and we provide them information and advice. I've focused much on raising awareness about the aspect of racism and discrimination. The action plan on Roma and Sinti of the OSCE, adopted in 2003, is built on this core principle of combating racism and discrimination.
This is the starting point. Okay.
Yes. We speak of Roma and Sinti in OSCE because they were identified as a group that it's targeted by racism and discrimination in a very disproportionate way.
Sure.
And therefore, OSCE participating states, they realize the need to have such a focused action plan and have a department in OSCE that is specifically dealing with these issues. So that's very important. This work on combating racism and discrimination was at the core of most of the activities that I, together with my colleagues, I worked on in these past years. And it helped. It helped because it increased the visibility of the issue, and more, let's say, local Roma organizations, they joined the voice and message that donors, international donors, they have to rebalance their approach in terms of funding opportunities. Because in the past decade, and especially with many countries entering European Union, the discourse was focusing predominantly on social inclusion, speaking about poverty. And sure, these are problems.
Sure, but you haven't fundamentally.
Yes, these are more symptoms and
exactly.
effects. Yeah. So nowadays, the existing programs and funding opportunities, they don't touch so directly and in a articulated manner the main problem, which is, combating prejudice, racism, discrimination, hate-motivated violence. There is a continuous pattern throughout Europe, regardless of, location, of hate-motivated crimes and incidents against Roma. And very often, these are met with impunity. We come back to the problem I mentioned. As long as this racism is considered acceptable, then the inclusion policies will fail, obviously. And on top, there's going to be a significant waste of funding. Why not use the funding and resources to tackle properly the problem? And if you address this problem, the other areas will benefit directly and implicitly.
You've just naturally led me to ask, sure, but how then do you then tackle the problem at the core? Which sector would you go to? What are we talking about?
Access to justice, equal access to justice.
Rule of law?
Sure, yeah. Rule of law. If rule of law is only for some, and for perpetrators of crimes against Roma is not, then we have a systemic problem.
Final question. We mentioned, of course, the Roma Summit for the sixth consecutive year this year. How important do you think such events, which bring both the local communities, Roma organizations, but civil society from across the region with some international figures as well, how important do you think such events are for, first of all, for raising awareness, but also for finding and searching solutions which can be implemented, which can actually have a real on-the-ground effect?
A very important role, and I explain why. Normally, such processes must be led by governments, but we see very often that this is not happening. And then you need somebody to step in. Sometimes it's a local organization. It has a range and impact and influence only locally. Yeah. But these are national problems and sometimes regional and international. Yeah. So it always helps with a well-established organization that is known to promote respect and protection of human rights and promote intercultural dialogue and inclusiveness and mutual understanding. Comes with its practice, mandate, name, recognition, and facilitates and sometimes leads a process, as in the case of civil rights defenders and the summit, in the very summit, leads a process where important actors pertaining to this, problematic of Roma and Sinti, they are brought together regularly to discuss, to exchange information, to assess critically, to engage in self-assessment critically, and try to communicate with authorities. That's what is not done enough, and not only that is not done enough, but it does not produce effects and after effects. Yeah, they only happen occasionally, and then okay, we shake hands, we have a nice report.
Sure.
There is not much happening afterwards.
Sure.
Yeah. It's frustrating and it's a bitter experience because the problem is complex. The population that it's affected by it is big. And on top you have prejudice, you have lack of interest, you have extremism.
Media.
Yes, you have media putting fire on top, and progress is very difficult. But there is no other way. You have to keep doing it.
Continuity.
Yes, you have to keep doing it, but always try and focus on the practical ways and on ways and solutions that are systemic. Projects will always exist, and many are very happy to live only with projects, but they are short-lived and the impact is minimum, unfortunately. Projects are always a good way of showing that an existing problem can have a practical solution. And once you prove that, then it's in the interest of those who piloted that practice, as well as the local and national authorities, to assess it and take whatever it's good, practical, functional, scale it up, and make it their own policy. And then sure, if you have a policy and you have also resources allocated for that, and you continue implementing and enforcing that policy, then you can measure in 5 years, in a decade,
Sure.
you can speak of a
Sure.
before and after.
Sure.
Yes?
Sure.
But if you have projects of 1 year, and very often these projects, they only speak about poverty, and very often such projects, they don't manage to produce any positive effect or meaningful positive effect for the people and their lives. And it's only about meetings and some trainings and so on, and it doesn't help. because the population which is in the most need is not directly benefiting of this. Yeah. So practicality, it's essential, and make sure you have enough diversity of stakeholders, including within the Roma. Try to avoid an inertia where you only deal with a couple of most known leaders or organizations. Yeah. Make sure there is enough consultation, openness and participation. Yeah.
Thank you so much, and we wish you the best in the remainder of your term, and of course your successor. And I think this year will be particularly about what we're trying to do is really focus on the assessments and focus on the outcomes and what we've managed to achieve over the 6 years. So we look forward to releasing some of the results and hopefully to continue making an impact.
Well, congratulations for having this continued series.
Thank you.
And good luck with the incoming forum.